Welcome, everyone, to episode number 8 of Off the Shelf, a podcast that looks at what it means to be a true follower of Jesus, specifically in the context of Scripture and the message of William Branham. With me today is my esteemed co-host, Rod Bergen.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever it is you are listening to us. We literally have listeners from around the globe, and we are so happy to have you as part of our conversation today. Today, we are actually coming to you from 3 different time zones.
We are, Rod, and you know we've had some fantastic guests join us over the last few episodes, and today's is no exception. Joining us on this edition of Off the Shelf is James Rozak, the author of morningmercy.com. If you're not familiar with the website, it's a resource for former followers of William Branham.
What I really like about Morning Mercy is that it's very pastoral in nature, and that, James, comes from your background as a former minister at Edmonton Living Word Fellowship, which is a message church in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Yes, he was a pastor, Rod, and that really comes across in the tone of his site. It has a very compassionate, healing tone, and I love it. Well, let's bring him in and get started. Welcome, James.
Hello. Nice to be here. Nice to be with both of you who I've known through the years, and I just feel honored to have been asked to participate in what you guys are doing here.
We're really glad to have you here, James. You know, we started off, we asked most people the same question. How did you come into the message?
Well, it was probably similar to a lot of people that, they're born into the message, and that was my case. My parents were message believers in the 1970s, so they had a lot of influence around them with their own family being in the message. And my grandmother was a very staunch message believer, very passionate woman who, a lovely person, but she was just oozed passion for the message. And so I was exposed to it, from the time of my birth. My dad was instrumental in the message in Edmonton being spread. They, in fact, had the very first message church in Edmonton was run out of my grandmother, who was a Ukrainian Orthodox. She allowed them to gather in her basement, and they began, that's where the church in Edmonton basically began. And I'm not sure what year that was, but, it was early 1970s, I would suspect. And I was born in 1977, so I was born right into that. And I probably was considered a risk being born in 1977 by what we know. But But my parents, they forged ahead in the message, and they actually ended up leaving the message when I was approximately 8 years old. I don't know the exact age I was, but I always say about 8 years old. And they were kind of the collateral damage of a church split, which was a frequent event, throughout the message. And so I actually had a span of time where I wasn't in the message, but because of the extended family that was in the message, I was always around it. It was always, visiting my grandmother, and she being passionate the way she was, she would, I can't recall a time of visiting her where it didn't turn into listening to her telling stories of Brother Branham and her experiences and that sort of thing. So it was always there. And then myself having grown up around it as a younger child, you're around those rules and that lifestyle. And so it was very ingrained into me. And so it was very confusing to be pulled out of a message church. So I was trying to maintain, I always say I was like trying to maintain the lifestyle without understanding, there's a lot of fear attached to it, the discipline of addressing certain ways. And my parents actually held on to it for a period of time, the rules. They never went to a denominational church or anything. They just stopped going. And so I was very confused growing up. And it ended up being that when I was somewhat older, I think I was 18, 19, I was very depressed because I was trying to uphold, I don't know what it was, but I was very convicted of, I couldn't do the things the other kids were doing because I still was holding on to these rules. And it wasn't that my parents were really enforcing them, but, it was so deeply ingrained. And I kind of have a perspective that as a child, those first early years of being raised under legalism, it really puts an impact on who you are. So I struggled all through my teens and everything, and by the time I got to about 21 years old, the immense pressure that I was feeling from my grandmother in particular. She even went so far as to tell me that if my parents were going to be saved, that my parents were going to come back to the message, it was up to me. And so I was like compelled to change something in my life. And at 21 years old, circumstances just kind of aligned, and I found myself calling up a relative who was in one of the local churches in Edmonton. I said, can I come to church? And that was the first time I went. It was in 1998. And I never stopped. It was intense how I went in. It was like putting on a glove almost, because I had fought within myself. I didn't drink, I didn't swear, I didn't do anything. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't do any of those things, and yet I wasn't a message believer or anything. So when I went to a message church, it was like I was home. It was these people didn't drink, smoke, swear, do any of these things. So I just thought, wow, like I fit in. This is the first time I felt I fit in. And so when I went in, I went in hard.
So you were raised in a message environment,
yes,
but you didn't go to church.
No.
In a message church as a kid.
I did till I was about 8 years old.
8 years, and then your parents left.
Yes, and that's when it was probably in the aftermath, a couple years after there was a major church split, and there was a lot of people involved. My family was involved. Half my family went to one church, half went to the other, and the things that the ministry were saying about about each other. My dad actually was very conflicted because he didn't understand the way the message was presented. We were supposed to be, exude love and harmony and brotherhood. And yet, in the morning he would go to one church and he would listen to the minister berate the other church. And then in the evening they would go to the other church and they would listen to that church berate the other church. And finally he just said, I don't know what this is, but this isn't good, and I'm out of here. And that shut him down, and he was, so I was around it till 8 years old. And, so 8 years being in the message as a child, living by those strict rules, it really had an impact on me. I can definitely say that. Yeah.
So when you went through that period of turmoil, there was no other option for you. When you needed somewhere to go, it was going to be the message. Why do you think that was?
Well, in fact, I'll give you a little story. I didn't understand who William Branham was. My grandmother could tell me stories of it, but I didn't understand the profoundness of the doctrine, or, I just knew that he was this miraculous man, and so, but I didn't understand. I never even heard the term denomination. It wasn't in my vernacular. So there was an occasion where I was, 19 years old or something, and I was feeling very compelled to go to church. And there was a schoolmate of mine who had invited me to go to church. And I told my mom, I said, tomorrow morning I'm going to go to church with this girl from school. And it was just an Assemblies of God church just down the road. And my mom, even though she had been away from the message all those years, she hadn't had the privilege of, understanding what the message was from the view that we have now as ex-believers. She wasn't aware of problems. She was more or less forced out of the church. So even though she didn't go and she could see there was issues, she didn't understand. So she still had a fear of denominations or any other church. So in fact, when I told her I'm going to go to this church, this denominational church, my mom said, well, you know what Brother Branham says about denominations. I didn't have a clue. So I went, there was something that transpired where, this girl kind of got me thinking like, well, does she go, her behavior didn't model what, I had been raised around and what my grandmother would do. And so I went home and I ended up reading, going down to the basement. My dad had all his message books. I pulled out questions and answers and I started reading about denominations. And that was all I had to go on. All I heard was, I read that William Branham said denominations are bad. And that's all I had to draw from. And so I thought, well, denominations must be bad. And so that's where I pretty much decided, well, if I'm going to go to church, I may as well go to a message church because that seems to be the only option. That's kind of more or less how it transpired. Yep. That, as if I could interject, that's kind of where, with my kids growing up, I want to talk to them about what I saw, what I know. My parents never said a word. The day we left church as a child, they never told us why. They never talked to us about anything. All those years, nothing. And so the vacuum of, that's kind of why I struggled for years. You know, I didn't understand what it was that, that was going on between denominations, between the message. I had nothing to go from. So when I wanted to go back to church, my parents couldn't speak up and say, well, you should think about this. You should think about that. They never had the information, for one. I do. So I can now communicate. I think it's important for anybody to talk to their kids, just to inform them. It's not even to tell them you can't do this. It's just to say, well, you should know. And this is stuff that I learned.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Very important. So you arrived in a message church and you found yourself feeling at home.
Yes.
You were attracted to the people because it agreed with your conception of what church was supposed to be like? Absolutely.
My mother, after we left the message, my mother had maintained that legalistic view. So for years after, even though not going to a message church for years, she would wear a dress. She wouldn't cut her hair for years. And so, you look up to your mother. She epitomized a woman to me. And so that's kind of how I always leaned that way. I always thought, well, that's the way. No reason, no doctrinal reason, no nothing. It was just, that's how my grandmother dressed. That's how my mother dressed. And so, when you're growing up in high school and whatnot, you get to see you get to see what other kids are like, and you get the good and the bad, and you can't make heads or tails of a lot of things. So it seemed like the people in the message, because I would get together with them at, say, Christmas time, and they would sit around, and they were lovely people. They truly were. They were, and you'd see their standard and their dress, and it was appealing to me. It seemed like, well, that's nice. It's wholesome. It seems good, and that's all I had to go by, was just my perception and my emotions. So it was attractive to me. It definitely was.
Yeah. So how long were you in the message?
So those 8 years as a child, it's hard to count those in a way, because I didn't understand the message. I was just under the influence of it. But when I was 21 years old when I came into the message, and I think it was about a total of 15 years that I was as an adult. So, if you count it all together, right around 23 years. But really, it was around me my whole life. Even when I wasn't in a message church, I was always around that influence. It was always there. So I was 35 when I left, 35, 36.
So how did you come to be a minister in the message?
Well, given my circumstance of being out in the world and then coming into the message, and like I said earlier, I kind of came in full blast, and this is something I didn't realize at the time. But when it wasn't that they had a lot of converts. In the time that I was in the message, you didn't see too many new people walking through the doors. And then whenever somebody new did come in, it was, there was a stir in the crowd, because it was somebody new. And so when I came in, new blood was exciting, and especially for me, when I came in, I embraced it immediately. I had numerous people tell me that in the first 2 years that I was in the message, like I had grown spiritually faster than anyone they had seen. So, people, I'm sure you've seen it. They kind of hold up certain people as kind of a marker, of, this is who we should be striving to be, or, and you had certain pillars in the church. And so I didn't realize it was happening to me, but I was definitely being kind of propped up as a bit of a figure in the young people, because I was so fervent. And when I came in, I would read endlessly message books. I would listen to tapes endlessly. I don't think I missed a church service for 3 years. And because I was seeing the lack of enthusiasm in other people, because the other young people had grown up in this, and it was maybe stale to them. There wasn't a fire in them, and there was a fire in me because what I had come through to where I was. And so I was immediately, within a year or two, I was leading Sunday school. And then I was song leading. And of course, I felt a passion in me to kind of exhort my peers. And I think that I never had a supernatural event, like I've heard other people. That was actually something that bothered me because I didn't have a voice coming from heaven telling me that, I didn't have a light appear to me. It wasn't anything like that. It was just a desire to contribute. And I remember praying, I'm available, use me. I want to be used. And so I went on a mission trip early as a young man to the Ukraine, accompanying my pastor and men like Lonnie Jenkins and Jason Watkins and different ones like that. And so I was around it. I was eager to do something. And then I can say I wasn't very good at it when I started. I was reluctant. I'm an introvert, so it's very against my nature. But by the fourth year in the message, I just couldn't get away from it. My pastor had asked me on more than one occasion, to speak. And so I started to do it. And I started leading youth camps, young people services, and that kind of thing. And the next thing, you're being invited to other churches and other places and other countries. And so it kind of built up that way.
So I know, you were a fervent believer.
Yes.
And one of the things that always disturbs me is it's kind of a little bit of sour grapes, but it's very common for people that are still in the message to say about people that have left.
Yeah.
You never really believed the message. How do you react to something like that?
I mean, it's not pride or anything like that, but I threw myself into it. I did. Like I said, I don't think I missed a church service for two. I got to the point where I was a little bit critical of other people because they didn't come to church every service. The young people were going skiing on a weekend, and they would leave on a Friday and they wouldn't come back on a Saturday night, because church is on Sunday, and I had a message book wherever I went. I would rush out at lunch when I was at work. At lunch, I would run to my car, pop in a tape, and I'd listen the whole time, hours and hours and hours. I loved it. I did. There was no doubt,
So you're kind of like Paul, who said he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. You were a believer of the message believer.
I feel like I was. I don't feel like there was any point where, even right up to the very end, I don't feel like I was pretending or posturing or putting anything on. Even when I began to see problems per se, my intention was, I'm going to fix this. For the well-being of my church, of my family. I'm going to fix this. I don't want to. I'd see other people questioning, and so I would dig in a little bit deeper because I didn't want to see them hurting or confused to suggest that I didn't believe it. Yeah, I kind of concur with what you said. It hurts a bit. It's a bit insulting, but there's no way to convey that amount of passion that I had, because we're on a different path now. But I mean, the leaving was a struggle, because I believed it so much. It hurt. It hurt so much. It was agony. The last few months was agony. And even after we left, it was agony. It was brutal. You felt shattered, because it's
pretty common.
I didn't want it. I didn't want this. And here I was, on the outside. And
you mentioned watching other people question and wanting to dig in for their sake. Was that what started your journey out, or was it something else?
In hindsight, there were warning signs. There was things that, I was, always kind of contending with internally. But those were some of the first things that were going on. Was, I recall very specific events like Rod, your son, and I were very good friends. I don't know if you mind me mentioning names or anything, but
I have no problems.
Okay, yeah. So Jake and I were very good friends, and I recall one day going out to Red Robin's after, it was a restaurant here in Edmonton, after a service, and we were sitting around. There was actually a couple other deacons at the table, and there was a comment. It was just kind of a passing conversation where there was a comment alluding to the fact that that we are the bride, and it's only the bride that's going to make the rapture, and it was just a conversation, and out of nowhere Jake piped up, and I remember his first words. He said, "I don't know about that." And it was a shock to me because, I didn't know where that came from or what he was thinking or why he said it. And so, there was a immediate discomfort that occurred, but that, that began to lead to conversations. And it wasn't, in fact, it wasn't Jake then beginning to bombard me with things. It was me becoming aware that there was something going on. And that's where I began to be introduced to some of the things that were going on a little bit. I had another friend who was in church who became privy to some discussions that were happening with some other people. And it was a kind of a discussion forum thing. And I got invited into it as a minister. I was kind of peeping into a conversation that felt like of, people just asking questions. There was, in one way, it was completely harmless. There was a few other ministers that were there, and they were just asking questions. And I think you were a part of that, Rod, at that time. And so I just observed. I was just observing, kind of soaking it in, trying to find answers in my own self, and it was definitely challenging at the time. It feels like being slapped across the face a little bit because you're one big happy family, and then somebody throws a question into the mix and as we now know, questions aren't comfortable things within the message, and it wasn't comfortable for me, but it started something. Definitely. I had a lot of other, I was going to also elaborate just a little bit. There was some other, there was always some questions that bothered me through the years. And as far as my journey, kind of out of the message, I think in hindsight, there was little things that I wasn't aware that were bothering me as they were. For example, I always had the question why we didn't see ourselves as a denomination. And I kind of had a view like there's something a little bit wrong with like, why aren't we a denomination? Why aren't we? Because it seems like we are. It sure seems.
Certainly. By any definition, normal definition, the message is a denomination. There's no question.
Yeah. And so, I would read a quote from William Brown and basically saying like, I think it's in the church age book, the Ephesian church age, where he says, you take a group of people, they have a revival going on, and then they begin asking, how they can protect this truth that they have. And then they start building up the walls and they put a kind of a period behind it to protect it. And they put it all in a manual and that sort of thing. And then, William Brown says, then they organize and then they die. And so I was like, that sounds a whole lot like us. And yeah, it bothered me. Things like that bother me. So I would take 5 services in a row, about why we're not a denomination. And I was doing it because I felt other people had questions too about stuff like that. So, I would dwell on those things because they didn't seem to be clear in a lot of regards, and, no law but love, no book but the Bible, no creed but Christ. Really? Stuff like that bothered me, and I looked for answers on them. And yeah, so there was a lot of converging issues, and it began to stir something in me. And then the questions began to come, and I didn't ignore them. I didn't feel like as a minister, I didn't feel like I could ignore them. I didn't think I should ignore them. Because if there was a legitimate question, and my friend Jake has a question, well, yeah.
Perfect. Well, we try to keep these episodes to a half an hour or so for the sake of our listeners. So we're going to bring this one to a close, and we will continue our conversation in our next episode. James, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure.
And for all our listeners, please come back next week to hear our continued conversation with James Rozak, the author of morningmercy.com. If you'd like to send us an email, there's a link on offtheshelf.life, or you can email me directly at Brian@offtheshelf.life. That's Brian with a Y. And the Off the Shelf website also contains a comment section after each podcast. Just click on the title and it will take you to the page for that specific episode. The comment section is at the bottom of the page. Have a great week, everyone.
And I'd like to say, if you've got any questions, please feel free to send us an email, leave a comment. We've got a question we're going to deal with either next episode or the one after that. Let us know what's really on your hearts. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Have a great week, everyone.